King Charles had made a decision that stunned even those closest to him. Camilla would be left out of the new rule, reshaping how the family's youngest royals were protected. What began as a single drawing sketched quietly by Louis without a single crown in sight had somehow become the reason a queen found herself excluded from her own household's most private conversations. Nobody inside the palace expected paper and crayon to expose so much. Before we go any further into what this decision really meant, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss the next royal investigation, because stories like this rarely end where they begin. Looking back now, the warning signs were always there. Most people simply weren't paying close enough attention to a summer afternoon in Glasgow that seemed at the time entirely unremarkable. The document sat on King Charles's desk for less than a minute before the room fell silent. He had summoned only a handful of senior aides, and none of them had been told what the meeting was truly about. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the usual formality reserved for household business. He simply said that the way decisions were made about his grandchildren was about to change, and that change would begin immediately. The protocol itself was short, barely more than a single page, but its wording was unmistakable. Any matter concerning George, Charlotte, or Louis, their appearances, their privacy, their protection from public exposure, would now require direct approval from Charles himself alongside William and Catherine. The list of those permitted in such discussions was specific. Camilla's name was not among them. For a moment, nobody in the room reacted. Aides accustomed to reading between the lines of royal language understood immediately that omission was rarely accidental. One senior advisor glanced at the page twice, as though searching for an explanation that might soften what he was seeing. There was none. The king had chosen his words with obvious precision and precision. Inside these walls always meant intention. Charles signed the document without ceremony. No photographer stood nearby. No official statement had been prepared. This was not the kind of decision meant for public unveiling, at least not yet. He set down his pen and, for the first time since the meeting began, allowed his composure to slip. His eyes moved toward the corner of his desk where a single folded sheet of paper rested beneath a leather folder. It was a child's drawing. Simple lines, uneven proportions, the kind of artwork any parent might pin to a refrigerator door without a second thought. Yet Charles had not discarded it, nor filed it away among the countless gifts and letters that passed through his office. He had kept it deliberately close, as though its presence explained something the formal protocol never could. One aide more familiar with the king's habits than the others noticed the drawing and hesitated before speaking. He asked carefully whether the change was connected to the sketch resting beside the signed document. Charles did not answer directly. Instead, he asked the room a question of his own. He wanted to know how a family was supposed to protect a child's honesty once the adults around that child had already begun deciding which truths were convenient to hear. The question unsettled everyone present precisely because no one had an answer prepared. It was not the kind of inquiry a king typically posed during matters of household governance. It sounded instead like something carried from a private wound rather than a policy discussion. What made the moment more striking was what went unsaid. Nowhere in the meeting did Charles explain why Camilla specifically had been excluded from the new arrangement. No accusation was made, no fault was assigned aloud, and yet the absence of her name felt louder than any explanation could have been. Those present understood enough about palace communication to recognize that silence in moments like these was rarely empty. It was a boundary being drawn without the need for further words. Word of the protocol would not reach beyond a small circle that day, but its consequences had already begun to take shape. A senior secretary was tasked with quietly updating internal briefing lists, removing a name that had appeared on nearly every family-related document for years. The instruction was delivered without explanation, and none was requested. Everyone understood that some questions were not meant to be asked twice. As the meeting closed, Charles remained seated alone for several minutes, the folded drawing still resting beside him. He did not return it to a drawer nor hand it to an assistant for safekeeping. He simply looked at it as though searching for something inside those uneven crayon lines that the formal language of royal protocol could never fully capture. Outside that office, the family carried on as though nothing had shifted. Louis remained unaware that a piece of his imagination had quietly reshaped decisions far beyond his understanding. Camilla, too, had not yet been told directly what had changed, though she would soon sense it in the smallest of ways: an omitted briefing, an unfamiliar silence where inclusion once stood without question. But to understand why Camilla's name was missing, one had to go back to a single afternoon in Glasgow that no headline had explained. News of the protocol moved slowly, at first passed between only a few trusted voices before it reached the people it affected most directly. Camilla learned of it not through Charles himself, but through a briefing document that no longer carried her name where it once had. She read the omission twice before setting the page down, unwilling to let her expression reveal what she felt in front of staff still lingering nearby. She said nothing that afternoon. Those who knew her well understood that her silence was rarely emptiness. It was restraint carefully practiced after decades of learning which battles deserved public reaction and which deserved private thought. Yet even her closest attendants noticed a change in her demeanor, a stillness that lingered longer than usual after she read anything concerning the grandchildren she had grown to adore. William received the news differently. He had not been present when his father signed the protocol, but he understood its implications the moment he saw the revised distribution list. His loyalty pulled in two directions at once. He respected his father's instinct to protect the children from unnecessary exposure, yet he could not ignore the discomfort of watching Camilla quietly pushed outside a circle she had belonged to for years. He chose for the moment to say nothing, though the tension remained visible in the careful way he avoided the subject entirely during a brief exchange with aides. Catherine's reaction carried a different weight altogether. Where William hesitated, she felt a quiet sense of relief settle over her, one she did not openly express but could not fully hide either. She had long believed that decisions involving George, Charlotte, and Louis required a smaller, more protective circle, one shaped entirely around the children's comfort rather than the wider expectations of the institution. The new protocol, whatever its origin, aligned closely with instincts she had carried since Louis first began attending public engagements. Still, she recognized the human cost embedded within the decision. Catherine had spent years watching Camilla engage warmly with her children, offering advice drawn from her own experience raising a blended family. The idea that such warmth might now exist behind an invisible boundary troubled her, even as she understood why Charles had drawn the line where he did. Within the household, reactions varied according to how closely each person had witnessed the quiet moments building toward this decision. Senior aides who had overheard fragments of private conversations understood the protocol as inevitable, a formal response to something long unspoken. Others, further removed from the family's daily rhythms, viewed it with confusion, unable to reconcile the sudden change with the warmth Camilla had always shown toward her step-grandchildren in public settings. Camilla, for her part, chose not to confront Charles immediately. She recognized the danger of reacting emotionally to a decision she did not yet fully understand. Instead, she requested time alone, retreating to a private sitting room where she reread the revised protocol several times, searching for language that might explain the reasoning behind her exclusion. The document offered no clarity. It listed boundaries without justification, leaving her to fill the silence with her own uncertainty. That evening, during a brief and carefully neutral conversation with Charles, she asked only whether something specific had prompted the change. He gave her a measured response, acknowledging that recent events had shaped his thinking without revealing what those events actually were. Camilla did not press further, though the restraint in her voice suggested the answer had done little to ease her concern. William, watching the distance grow between his father and stepmother, found himself caught between competing instincts. He wanted to protect his children's boundaries, yet he also recognized the toll such exclusion could take on family relationships built over many years. He considered raising the matter directly with Charles, but hesitated, uncertain whether doing so might reopen a wound still too fresh to examine closely. By the time the household settled into evening routines, an unspoken tension had settled over Windsor. Nothing had been said publicly. Nothing had been confirmed beyond a small circle of trusted staff. Yet everyone touched by the decision sensed that something fundamental had shifted, even if its origins remained hidden behind palace walls. But none of them yet understood how this had really begun. The story that reshaped a household protocol did not begin inside a palace corridor. It began during a summer afternoon in Glasgow amid the noise and color of the Commonwealth Games, where the Wales family had gathered for what appeared to every onlooker like an ordinary public outing. Louis had grown restless between events, as children often do when surrounded by ceremony designed for adults. While William and Catherine spoke with volunteers near the velodrome and George and Charlotte watched the track cycling with focused enthusiasm, Louis retreated quietly to a nearby bench with a notepad an aide had given him earlier to keep him occupied. He began to draw unbothered by the crowds or the cameras positioned at a respectful distance. What emerged on the page was simple, the kind of unguarded creation only a child could produce. 5 figures stood together without crowns, without formal dress, without any symbol distinguishing them from an ordinary family enjoying an afternoon outdoors. To Louis, it was nothing more than a quiet way to pass the time. Camilla, who had joined the family briefly during a lull between engagements, noticed the drawing resting on his lap. She smiled at its simplicity and, meaning only warmth, remarked to a nearby aide that the sketch was sweet, though clearly just a child's imagination rather than anything meaningful. Her tone was affectionate, entirely innocent in intention, yet the words themselves carried an unintended dismissiveness that would later travel further than she ever expected. The aide, unaware of how closely such comments could be scrutinized within palace circles, mentioned the remark in passing during a routine debrief later that day. It was meant as nothing more than an observation about the family's relaxed atmosphere at the games, but somewhere between that casual mention and its eventual path toward Charles, the comment shifted in tone, stripped of its original warmth, and reframed as evidence of indifference toward something Louis had created with quiet sincerity. By the time the remark reached Charles, it no longer resembled the affectionate observation Camilla had intended. It arrived instead as a suggestion that the drawing and, by extension, the sentiment behind it had been treated as inconsequential. Charles, who had grown increasingly attentive to how the children processed the pressures of public life, reacted with more concern than the moment might have warranted under different circumstances. He requested the drawing be retrieved, a task quietly carried out by a member of staff without Louis ever realizing its significance. When Charles finally examined it alone, he saw something far more layered than a simple child sketch. 5 figures without crowns represented to him an unspoken longing for ordinary belonging, the very thing royal life so often made difficult to preserve. The distance between Camilla's original intention and the interpretation that reached Charles created a quiet rift neither of them yet understood. She remained unaware that her light-hearted remark had traveled beyond its original context, transformed into something far weightier by the time it reached the king. Charles, meanwhile, had no reason to question the account he received, given the trusted source through which it arrived. What began as an offhand comment during a joyful family outing had, through a series of small missteps in communication, become the foundation for a much larger reconsideration of how decisions surrounding the children would be made. Charles found himself troubled not simply by the remark itself, but by the broader question it raised. He wondered how many other small moments involving his grandchildren had been quietly minimized without anyone recognizing the weight those moments carried for the children themselves. The drawing remained on his desk in the days that followed, a quiet reminder of a conversation he had not yet had with anyone directly involved. He said nothing to Camilla nor to William or Catherine, choosing instead to sit with his own uncertainty before deciding what, if anything, should change. Camilla, unaware that her words had taken on a life far removed from her intention, continued her royal duties as usual, attending engagements and receiving a new patronage honor from the journalist's charity days later, entirely unaware that a much quieter storm had already begun forming behind palace walls. But what happened afterward changed everything. Charles requested Camilla join him privately, choosing a quiet room away from the usual traffic of aides and household staff. He wanted no witnesses to what he intended to say, and no risk of the conversation being softened by the presence of others. When she arrived, she sensed immediately that this was not an ordinary discussion. He began without preamble, placing the folded drawing on the table between them. Camilla recognized it instantly and offered a small, genuine smile, still unaware of the weight it now carried. Charles did not return the smile. Instead, he asked her directly whether she remembered what she had said about the sketch during their afternoon in Glasgow. The question caught her off guard. She searched her memory before recalling the brief exchange with the aide, the light-hearted comment she had made without a second thought. She explained her intention, plainly describing the warmth behind her words rather than the dismissiveness Charles had come to believe defined them. Charles listened, though his expression remained guarded. He revealed for the first time how the remark had reached him and how it had been framed by the time it did. Camilla's composure faltered slightly as she realized how far her words had traveled from their original meaning and how much had been built upon an account she had never had the chance to correct. She asked him plainly why he had not simply come to her first before allowing a second-hand version of events to shape his understanding so completely. Charles admitted with noticeable difficulty that his reaction had less to do with her words specifically, and more to do with a deeper unease he had been carrying for some time. He confessed that he often worried whether the family, himself included, had grown too accustomed to treating the children's private moments as material for public narrative, even unintentionally. The conversation shifted from accusation to something more vulnerable. Charles explained that the drawing had unsettled him precisely because it revealed how Louis viewed his family away from ceremony and expectation, without crowns or formality, simply as people who belonged together. He feared that comments like the one relayed to him, regardless of original intention, reflected a broader pattern of adults failing to protect that unguarded honesty. Camilla countered gently but firmly, reminding him that intention mattered, and that reducing her affection for the children to a single misinterpreted remark risked causing harm far greater than the moment itself. She pointed out that trust within a family could not survive if secondhand impressions were allowed to outweigh direct conversation. Charles did not offer an apology outright, though his silence carried an acknowledgement that the situation had moved further than perhaps it should have. He explained that the protocol had already been drafted before their conversation, a decision made in the heat of his concern rather than after careful reflection. Camilla asked whether he intended to reverse it now that she had clarified her intentions. He hesitated, unwilling to commit to an answer in that moment. The unresolved tension between them settled heavily in the room. Camilla left the conversation without the reassurance she had hoped for, while Charles remained seated long after she departed, turning the drawing over in his hands as though searching for an answer the paper itself could never provide. What became clear, though unspoken between them, was that the protocol had never truly been about a single remark taken out of context. It had become instead a reflection of Charles's growing anxiety about protecting his grandchildren's unguarded moments from an institution that too easily reshaped simple truths into something else entirely. Camilla's exclusion was not punishment for what she had said, but a boundary born from Charles's own uncertainty about how closely even those closest to the children could be trusted to preserve their innocence. Neither of them left that private meeting fully satisfied, and neither yet understood how quickly the household itself would begin responding to a decision that had started as nothing more than a quiet misunderstanding. What had begun as a private misunderstanding between Charles and Camilla no longer remained confined to family conversation. Once the protocol existed in written form, it became something the palace's formal structures were obligated to process regardless of the emotional nuance behind its origin. Private secretaries, accustomed to translating royal intention into procedure, now faced the task of turning Charles's personal unease into institutional language. A senior private secretary reviewed the document, carefully aware that its wording carried consequences far beyond a single family disagreement. Any formal restriction involving access to decisions about the whale's children required coordination across several offices, each responsible for different aspects of household operation. What Charles had drafted quickly in a moment of concern now needed to withstand the scrutiny of established royal procedure. Legal advisors were consulted briefly, not because the protocol carried constitutional weight, but because household governance often required precise boundaries to prevent future disputes over who held authority in specific circumstances. They examined the language surrounding parental consent, noting that Charles had intentionally placed final authority with William and Catherine rather than reserving it entirely for himself. This detail mattered greatly to those interpreting the document, as it signaled a broader philosophical shift rather than a simple personal grievance. Discussions soon expanded beyond the immediate matter of Camilla's exclusion. Advisors raised questions about succession planning and how such protocols might apply as George grew older and began assuming more public responsibility. The conversation, originally rooted in a child's drawing and a misinterpreted remark, had evolved into something touching the deeper architecture of how the monarchy prepared its next generation for public life. Charles insisted on personally overseeing the final language of the protocol, rather than delegating the task entirely to his staff. He wanted no ambiguity in how the boundaries were defined, and no room for future reinterpretation that might dilute the intention behind his decision. This insistence surprised several advisors who were accustomed to the king allowing established procedure to shape such documents without direct personal involvement. Behind closed doors, some staff quietly debated whether the protocol represented an overcorrection born from a single misunderstanding or a necessary formalization of instincts Charles had been developing for some time. Those who had observed his growing concern over the children's exposure to public scrutiny believed the decision, however abrupt in its execution, reflected a genuine and long-considered priority rather than a reactive impulse. Others within the household viewed the situation differently, expressing quiet concern that formalizing a boundary around Camilla risked creating lasting institutional consequences for a matter that might otherwise have been resolved through direct conversation. They worried that once such language existed in official household documentation, reversing it would carry its own complications, regardless of how the personal relationship between Charles and Camilla eventually settled. As the protocol moved through internal review, its practical implications became clearer. Briefing distribution lists required updating. Meeting structures needed adjustment to reflect who could remain present during discussions involving the children. Household calendars previously arranged with Camilla's involvement assumed as a matter of course now required careful reconsideration to align with the new boundaries Charles had established. None of these changes were announced publicly, nor were they explained in detail to staff carrying out the adjustments. Instructions arrived quietly framed as routine administrative updates rather than the result of a deeply personal family conflict. This discretion was intentional, reflecting the household's long-standing practice of managing sensitive matters away from public visibility whenever possible. Yet even within this careful discretion, subtle signs of the shift became increasingly difficult to contain entirely. Staff who had worked closely with both Charles and Camilla for years noticed the altered rhythm of communication between them, a formality replacing what had once been an easy familiarity. Few understood the full context, but many sensed that something significant had changed beneath the surface of ordinary royal routine. The machinery had already begun moving. What had existed only as internal discussion soon became something Camilla could see reflected in her daily routine. The first sign arrived quietly in the form of a briefing document that no longer included her among its recipients. She noticed the omission immediately, though she said nothing to the staff member who delivered it, unwilling to draw attention to a change she suspected was deliberate rather than accidental. Meetings that once included her as a matter of habit now proceeded without any acknowledgement of her absence. Discussions concerning George's upcoming schooling arrangements, Charlotte's public engagements, and Louis's summer schedule moved forward through a smaller circle limited strictly to Charles, William, and Catherine. Camilla learned of these conversations only afterward through second-hand summaries offered with careful neutrality by staff uncertain how much detail to share. The household calendar reflected the shift as well. An engagement Camilla would once have attended alongside the children, a modest charity visit, tied loosely to one of William and Catherine's causes, proceeded without any invitation extended her way. She recognized the pattern quickly, though she chose not to comment on it directly, preferring instead to observe how consistently the boundary held before deciding whether to raise the matter again with Charles. Staff reassignments followed soon after, though, framed carefully as routine adjustments rather than consequences of the new protocol. A member of the household previously responsible for coordinating communication between Camilla's office and the Wales family's team found their role quietly narrowed, their involvement in matters concerning the children reduced without explicit explanation. The individual understood the underlying reason without needing it spoken aloud. Camilla's correspondence, too, reflected the change. Letters and reports concerning the children once copied to her as a matter of long-standing practice now arrived addressed solely to William and Catherine. She noticed the absence of her name on these documents with a quiet resignation, recognizing that whatever remained unresolved between herself and Charles had already begun reshaping the practical architecture of her daily role within the family. Despite these visible changes, Camilla maintained her public composure entirely. She continued fulfilling her official duties with the same warmth and dedication she always had, attending engagements tied to her patronages and offering no outward indication that anything within the household had shifted. Those who worked alongside her admired this restraint, even as they privately wondered how long she could continue absorbing such quiet exclusion without eventually addressing it more directly. William, observing these developments from a careful distance, grew increasingly uncomfortable with how thoroughly the protocol had begun reshaping everyday interactions. He recognized the boundary his father intended to establish, yet he could not ignore the toll such formal distance seemed to be taking on relationships built over many years of genuine warmth between Camilla and his children. He considered raising the matter again with Charles, though he hesitated, uncertain whether doing so might reopen tensions still too delicate to revisit. Catherine, meanwhile, noticed the practical benefits of the smaller, more protective circle now governing decisions about her children. Meetings felt more focused conversations, more directly centered on the children's needs rather than broader family dynamics. Yet even she recognized the quiet cost embedded within this clarity, aware that Camilla's exclusion carried emotional weight extending well beyond household logistics. As the visible consequences of the protocol settled into routine, an unspoken awkwardness began shaping interactions whenever the family gathered informally. Conversations that once flowed naturally between Camilla and the children now carried a subtle hesitation, an unfamiliar carefulness neither she nor they fully understood, though all sensed something beneath the surface had changed. Charles observed these shifts from a distance, as well aware of the discomfort his decision had introduced into the family's daily rhythm. He said nothing further to Camilla in the days that followed, choosing instead to let the protocol settle fully into practice before revisiting the conversation they had left unresolved. But one final meeting still remained. Charles requested Camilla join him once more, though this time the setting felt different, quieter, without the formality that had shaped their earlier conversation. He had spent the preceding days observing the consequences of his decision ripple through the household, and the weight of what he had set in motion had begun settling more heavily upon him than he anticipated. Camilla arrived without expectation, uncertain whether this meeting would offer resolution or simply another difficult exchange. Charles began differently this time, choosing vulnerability over formality. He admitted that watching her quietly absorb the practical consequences of the protocol without complaint or public grievance had affected him more than he expected. He confessed that his initial reaction had been shaped less by her actual words in Glasgow and more by an accumulating unease he had carried privately for months, concerning how easily the family's private moments seemed to become material for interpretation, distortion, and eventual consequence. Louis's drawing had simply crystallized a fear he had been unable to articulate until that moment. Camilla listened carefully, recognizing in his admission something she had long suspected but never heard him express so directly. She reminded him gently that protecting the children's innocence did not require isolating those who loved them just as deeply, even if imperfectly at times. She spoke of her own experience navigating a blended family, acknowledging the missteps she had made along the way, yet emphasizing that those missteps had never reflected anything less than genuine affection for George, Charlotte, and Louis. Charles asked her directly whether she still felt capable of protecting the children's trust, despite the boundary now standing between them. Camilla answered without hesitation, affirming that her commitment to their well-being remained unchanged, regardless of what formal documents dictated. She added with quiet firmness that trust could not be legislated back into existence through policy alone, but required consistent, direct communication moving forward. The conversation shifted toward practical considerations, though neither suggested reversing the protocol outright. Charles acknowledged that the boundary, however born from misunderstanding, had revealed a genuine need for clearer communication within the family regarding how private moments involving the children were shared, interpreted, and protected. Camilla agreed, suggesting that future concerns be addressed directly between those involved rather than filtered through second-hand accounts capable of distorting intention so easily. Neither Charles nor Camilla treated this conversation as a full resolution. The protocol remained unchanged in its formal structure, and Camilla's name did not immediately return to the distribution lists or meetings from which it had been removed. Yet something between them shifted nonetheless, a mutual acknowledgement that the distance created by misunderstanding need not translate into lasting emotional separation. Charles expressed quiet gratitude for her restraint throughout the preceding weeks, recognizing how easily the situation could have escalated into public disagreement rather than private reflection. Camilla, in turn, expressed understanding for the anxiety driving his decision, even as she maintained her belief that the execution had caused unnecessary hurt. As their conversation drew to a close, Charles retrieved Louis's drawing once more, studying it alongside Camilla for the first time. She smiled faintly, recognizing in the simple sketch the same warmth she had felt watching Louis created in Glasgow. Charles admitted that perhaps the drawing had never needed such elaborate interpretation at all, though the deeper questions it raised about protecting the children's honesty remained entirely valid. Their reconciliation, though genuine, did not erase the institutional boundary now embedded within household practice. Camilla left the meeting with clearer understanding of Charles's intentions, yet still uncertain how fully her previous role within the family's private decisions would eventually be restored. What remained unresolved between them privately would soon be tested publicly as the quiet tension building within palace walls prepared to meet the far less forgiving scrutiny of the outside world. News of the household protocol did not remain contained behind palace walls indefinitely. A partial account of the changes reached a royal correspondent through an unnamed source familiar with internal briefing structures, and within days speculation about a rift between King Charles and Queen Camilla began circulating across major outlets. Early coverage lacked precise detail, relying instead on vague references to a new arrangement governing decisions about the Wales children. Commentators speculated broadly about its origins, some suggesting a disagreement over public exposure. Others hinting at deeper tensions within the blended family that had simmered quietly since Camilla's marriage to Charles decades earlier. Television panels dedicated segments to dissecting the implications, with royal historians offering competing interpretations. Some framed the protocol as a natural evolution of Charles's protective instincts toward his grandchildren, consistent with broader efforts to shield George, Charlotte, and Louis from the intense scrutiny previous royal generations had endured. Others viewed it more critically, suggesting the decision reflected deeper insecurity within the family's blended dynamic, one they believed had never fully healed since Camilla joined the family. Public reaction split along similarly divided lines. Many expressed sympathy for Camilla, arguing that years of dedicated service and visible affection toward her step-grandchildren deserved more consideration than a single misunderstood remark seemed to warrant. Others defended Charles's decision, framing it as an understandable response from a grandfather determined to protect his grandchildren's emotional well-being above all other considerations, regardless of how uncomfortable the resulting boundary might feel. Social media amplified the debate considerably, with clips of Camilla's public appearances resurfacing alongside commentary questioning whether her composed demeanor masked deeper hurt. Supporters highlighted her consistent warmth toward the children across the years, pointing to specific engagements where her affection appeared genuine and unforced. Critics, meanwhile, used the moment to revisit long-standing skepticism about her place within the family, questioning whether the protocol confirmed suspicions some had held since her earliest years as Duchess of Cornwall. International outlets picked up the story as well, drawing comparisons to previous family boundary disputes that had captured public attention in years past. Analysts noted the timing's proximity to the family's recent reunion involving Harry, Meghan, and their children, suggesting broader questions about how the monarchy navigated boundaries between formal protocol and genuine family connection during a period already marked by visible strain. Palace officials declined to comment directly on the specifics of the protocol, offering only a brief and carefully worded statement, acknowledging that household arrangements evolved periodically to reflect the family's current priorities. This measured response did little to quiet speculation, and if anything intensified public curiosity about what precisely had prompted such a significant shift. Camilla, aware of the growing public conversation, chose not to address it directly through any official channel. She continued her scheduled engagements without deviation, maintaining the same composed warmth that had defined her public presence throughout her tenure as queen. Those close to her noted privately that she found the speculation difficult, particularly given how far removed the public narrative had drifted from the more nuanced, ultimately reconciled understanding she and Charles had reached privately. William and Catherine, meanwhile, remained entirely silent on the matter, declining to offer any statement that might further fuel public interpretation. Their silence, though intended to protect the children at the center of the controversy, was itself interpreted by some commentators as tacit confirmation that something significant had indeed occurred within the family's private dynamics. Charles, watching the coverage unfold from a careful distance, recognized the irony embedded within the public reaction. A decision made specifically to protect his grandchildren's privacy had instead generated exactly the kind of intense public scrutiny he had hoped to prevent. The drawing that started everything, meant to capture nothing more than a child's innocent view of family, had become fragmented across headlines and commentary far removed from its original unguarded simplicity. As public debate continued without resolution, all eyes turned toward the family's next scheduled appearance, where observers anticipated any visible sign that might confirm or contradict the speculation now dominating royal coverage. The family's next public engagement arrived with unusual weight attached to it. What might otherwise have passed as a routine church service became, in the eyes of commentators and casual observers alike, a moment carrying far greater significance than its modest scale suggested. Cameras positioned outside captured every detail with unusual intensity, aware that body language alone might offer the clearest answer to questions no official statement had addressed. Charles arrived first, accompanied by Camilla, their pace measured and unhurried. Observers noted immediately that she walked beside him rather than trailing slightly behind, a small but deliberate positioning that seemed to counter weeks of speculation, suggesting a widening distance between them. Charles offered her his arm as they approached the entrance, a gesture unremarkable in isolation, yet closely scrutinized given the surrounding context. William, Catherine, and the children arrived shortly after their own entrance, drawing equally careful attention. Louis, unaware of the deeper significance surrounding the occasion, waved cheerfully toward the gathered crowd. His enthusiasm, entirely unfiltered by the tension adults around him had spent weeks navigating. George and Charlotte followed with practiced composure, offering polite acknowledgement to well-wishers lining the pathway. As the family approached the entrance together, seating arrangements inside became the focus of particular interest. Camilla's position closer to Charles than some had anticipated, given recent coverage, offered a subtle but unmistakable signal. She did not appear positioned at any deliberate distance from the children, either exchanging a brief warm smile with Charlotte as the family settled into their places. Louis, seated between his parents, glanced briefly toward his grandmother during a quiet moment before the service began. Camilla returned his gaze with visible warmth, offering a small, reassuring smile that required no words to convey its meaning. Those observing closely recognized in that brief exchange something far more telling than any statement the palace might have issued. Throughout the service, the family maintained composed, dignified presence, offering little outward indication of the private complexity that had unfolded in recent weeks. Yet subtle details continued drawing attention from those trained to read such moments carefully. Charles glanced toward Camilla on several occasions throughout the proceedings, his expression carrying none of the tension that had defined their earlier private conversations. As the service concluded and the family emerged together, their exit carried its own quiet symbolism. Rather than departing in the smaller, more insular grouping that had characterized recent household arrangements, the family moved as a unified whole. Camilla, walking comfortably alongside Catherine as they made their way toward waiting vehicles. Louis, still trailing slightly behind, reached briefly for Camilla's hand as they crossed the courtyard, an unscripted gesture that immediately drew attention from photographers stationed nearby. The image captured in that fleeting moment would circulate widely in the hours that followed, offering the public a visual counterpoint to weeks of uncertain speculation. Commentators noted the significance, immediately suggesting that whatever tension had existed within the family appeared, at least outwardly, to have softened considerably. Charles, observing the moment from a short distance away, allowed himself a brief, genuine smile, the first visible sign of ease he had displayed publicly since the protocol first began reshaping the family's private dynamics. Camilla, meeting his gaze briefly across the courtyard, offered a small nod, an unspoken acknowledgement that whatever remained unresolved between them privately had not diminished the warmth still present at the family's core. No formal statement accompanied the appearance. No palace spokesperson offered commentary explaining the visible shift in positioning or the small unscripted gestures exchanged throughout the event. Yet for those who had followed the story closely, the symbolism required no further explanation. What the public witnessed that day was not a resolution announced through words, but one communicated entirely through presence, proximity, and the quiet trust of a child reaching instinctively for his grandmother's hand. In the weeks that followed, the household settled gradually into a rhythm shaped by everything that had unfolded since a single drawing first captured Charles's attention. The formal protocol remained in place, its language unchanged on paper, yet its practical application softened considerably as trust between Charles and Camilla found its footing once more. Camilla's name slowly reappeared on briefing documents concerning the children, though never with quite the same automatic inclusion it once carried. Meetings that had excluded her entirely now welcomed her presence again, though the household maintained a quieter awareness of how easily private moments could be misinterpreted once relayed through secondhand accounts. What had been lost in spontaneity was gradually replaced by a more deliberate, thoughtful approach to communication within the family. Charles reflected privately on what the entire episode had revealed about his own instincts. He recognized that his initial reaction, though rooted in genuine concern for his grandchildren's emotional well-being, had moved too quickly past direct conversation in favor of formal restriction. The experience left him more attentive to the difference between protecting his family and inadvertently distancing those who loved them just as deeply. Camilla, for her part, carried her own quiet reflection forward from the experience. She acknowledged in conversations with those closest to her that even innocent remarks required greater care within an environment where words so easily traveled beyond their original context. Yet she remained firm in her belief that genuine affection consistently demonstrated over time could withstand even the most difficult misunderstandings. William, watching the relationship between his father and stepmother gradually repair itself, felt a measure of relief he had not fully anticipated. He had worried during the weeks of visible tension that the formal distance might harden into something more permanent, altering the family's dynamic in ways difficult to reverse. Instead, he witnessed something more encouraging, a reminder that even significant misunderstandings could be met with honest reflection rather than lasting division. Catherine, meanwhile, maintained her belief in the value of a more protective, considered approach to decisions involving her children, even as the strictest elements of the original protocol relaxed over time. She recognized that the balance between openness and protection would likely remain an ongoing conversation within the family rather than something resolved permanently through a single document. Louis remained entirely unaware of the significance his simple drawing had carried within palace walls. He continued creating similar sketches in idle moments, unaware that one small unguarded creation had prompted such careful reconsideration of how his family approached privacy, trust, and protection. Charles kept the original drawing in a private drawer within his study, a quiet reminder of how easily innocent gestures could ripple outward into consequences no child could anticipate. The public conversation surrounding the episode gradually faded as well, replaced by newer stories and fresher speculation, as is often the nature of royal coverage. Yet those who had followed the story closely understood that something meaningful had shifted within the family during those difficult weeks, even if its full complexity remained known only to those who lived through it directly. What the episode ultimately revealed extended beyond questions of formal protocol or household governance. It exposed the delicate balance every family within the monarchy must navigate between protecting children from the pressures of public life and preserving the genuine warmth that made such protection worth pursuing in the first place. Charles, reflecting on the drawing one final time before returning it carefully to its drawer, understood, perhaps more clearly than ever, that no crown, no formal boundary, and no carefully worded protocol could fully safeguard a family from its own quiet fractures. What safeguarded them instead ultimately was the willingness to sit together, however imperfectly, and choose understanding over silence.